Today, we will start a discussion about the Islamic economic system. Our session today will be focusing on understanding the emergence of various economic systems. To begin, let's first understand what is economic system. It is important to note here that an economic system, in terms of its definition, is different than the definition of economics. I hope you still remember how to define economics. And please also remember the definition of Islamic economics. When we say an economic system, basically it refers to a set of values, laws, mechanism, and institutional setup and their implementation concerning various economic activities. Some major economic activities that will be of our interest throughout the discussion would involve consumption, production, distribution, and exchange. So these are four major types of economic activities. There are many other economic activities. So when we say an economic system, the values underlying the system is important. Therefore, when we say capitalism, socialism, and an Islamic economic system, each of them has their own unique values. And definitely each of the system also has certain laws as well as mechanism and institutions to ensure smooth running of the system. Why do we have various types of economic systems? A quick answer to this is because different society would organize itself according to certain values, cultures, and worldview, which are derived from the sources of authority of knowledge of that particular society. So when we say a Muslim society, definitely we have our own values, culture, and Islamic worldview. And we derive all this from our sources of authority. Recall, chapter 2, we talk about the sources of knowledge in Islam, Al-Quran and Sunnah, as our two primary sources of knowledge, thus also sources of authority. Different economic system arises because different society have different priorities. For example, a Muslim society would prioritize religion as their main point of concern, while in a capitalist society, wealth would be their main priority. Now, let's discuss various factors that influence the emergence or acceptance of different economic systems. The first one, we can talk about the historical and ideological background of a society, and then we can also evaluate the acceptance of a society towards certain economic system based on the political system adopted by the society. Third, it is also influenced by size and geography of the country. And the last point, the choice of economic system also depends on the level of development. So let's begin with the first one, history and ideology. The emergence of economic systems is based on the experience of mankind throughout many centuries. If we look at the conventional economics, namely capitalism and socialism, the center of the rise of these two systems would be in the European community or European countries. To trace back the history or ideology of these systems, we can go back to the time in Europe known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. This period is described as the lowest point in the European history, where the society is facing a demographic, cultural, and economic deterioration as a consequence of the decline of the Roman Empire. Take note that the decline of the Roman Empire mainly is due to the rise of the Islamic civilization. And during this Dark Ages time, the main system governing the society in the Europe is called the feudalist system or feudalism. Under this system, the main authority is the king, and under the king, there are many landlords. Under the landlords, there are people working for the landlord, and these people are known as serfs. Under the feudalist system, king amassed huge amount of wealth and power through military and loyalty by the landlords, and people under them had to pay taxes. During the Dark Ages time, there was a clash between the authority of the palace or king with the church, and at the same time, there was conflict between king and landlords. You can imagine when you watch Robin Hood movie, so you can see the conflict, the political conflict, and sometimes the conflict between church and palace is there in that movie. Then the attempt to break away from this control by the authority, namely palace or the authority of kings and landlords, as well as the authority of the churches, give rise to a new movement in Europe called the Renaissance. And this period is between the 40th and 50th centuries. Renaissance started the rise of more scientific discoveries in Europe, mainly contributed by the European society's interaction with the Islamic civilization in the Middle East. And slowly but surely, the influence of knowledge, particularly science, becoming more dominant, and this was not pleasant to the authorities, especially king and churches. At the same time, wealth, material power, capital still dominates the economic arena in Europe. So what happened here is more investment happened, especially for international trade. Dominant economic ideology during this time was known as mercantilism. This ideology basically defines wealth based on the amount of bullion or the amount of gold and silver owned by a nation. So what happened under this ideology, nation states, they preferred to do export of their goods and services, and they didn't like to do import. Why they prefer export? Because by exporting, they are getting gold and silver. If they import, they are paying using gold and silver. During this period, you will find the world history was dominated by colonization, especially by the European powers such as Britain, France, Spain, Portugal. Within Europe itself, there was a power struggle between king's authority and churches. In particular, the Catholic Church was criticized for certain transactions such as selling of the forgiveness letter or indulgence, and figures such as Martin Luther and John Calvin rose up, protested, and created split in the Christian religion. And the king took advantage of the split in the church to expand their influence and power. Religion became less important, and this marked the beginning of secularism in the European society. If you look at this figure, I hope you can identify who is this person. This is Adam Smith, and his main contribution to the economy came from his book, The Wealth of Nations. And before the publication of The Wealth of Nations, he published The Moral Sentiment. These two books provide the fundamental philosophy for capitalism. Adam Smith managed to put into a proper systematic explanation on various economic thoughts prior to him, package those thoughts to form a solid foundation for capitalism. Under the work by Adam Smith, I'm referring to The Wealth of Nations, he promoted the importance of self-interest, the importance of exchange, the importance of specialization, and the importance of market and competition. All these points basically become the foundation for capitalism. Nonetheless, over many years after the rise of capitalism, the European society faced the reality of capitalism, where the division between the rich and the poor became wider. Some philosophers, such as Karl Marx, started to observe the situation, and he proposed an alternative system to capitalism. He made 4 important points in his book, The Communist Manifesto. In this book, he stated the widening disparity in the European society. In that observation, Karl Marx argued that the rich or the capitalists dominated the economy as well as power, while workers were the victim. So point number 2, Karl Marx called for workers of the world to unite. For what? They would unite to start a revolution against the capitalist class. In fact, Karl Marx called for a violent revolution. The purpose of this revolution was to confiscate the wealth of the rich, and then point number 4, from the confiscation of the wealth, they would redistribute the wealth equally in the society, and then they will install a dictator to maintain the newly formed system. And this system is known as socialism. When we say socialism, there is also another important term used, socialism or communism. To understand what's the difference between socialism and communism, we need to know that socialism is a precursor to communism. It means that before you have communism, you need to have a socialism movement. Socialism promotes the redistribution of wealth. Communism is the ideal reality of socialism. So to recap, going back to Dark Ages time of Europe, we have a feudalism system, move to mercantilism, then capitalism, and as a protest to capitalism, then we have socialism. So that's about the historical and ideological background. What about the political system? Different economic systems are more compatible to certain political system. For example, in the case of a capitalist system, a much more compatible political system for it is a democratic political system. In a capitalist system, it is based on a market mechanism. Market requires flow of information, and under a democratic society, the flow is better because of the freedom of expression under a democratic system. In contrast, for a socialist system, as I mentioned earlier, the installation of dictator to maintain the system, because socialism is rigid. Socialism is more of a top-down authoritarian system. So to maintain discipline under the system, a dictator is needed. That's why many socialist countries, they have a communist political system. While for an Islamic system, we will talk about the concept of government or state when we get to the discussion about the role of government or state in Islam. Factors that influence the acceptance or adoption of certain economic system also depends on size and geography of the country. It is argued that large countries such as China, the Soviet Union before, they are more inclined to adopt socialism because given the vast amount of resources available to them, they can become self-sufficient. Socialism tends to be more of a closed economic system, while when we look at many capitalist economies, small countries can adopt the system because capitalism mainly is based on capital-intensive production. So with capital that requires huge injection of capital money, even with less amount of resources, provided there is an open trade, a small country can prosper under a capitalist system. Country like Japan becoming very successful when they adopt the capitalist system. And the last point here, we can also talk about level of development. Countries under a capitalist system would enjoy much rapid pace of growth as compared to socialist economies, because the priorities between these two systems are different. A capitalist system would prioritize economic growth, while a socialist economist would prioritize stability and quality. So these are the factors that mainly influence the adoption of certain economic system. Inshallah, we will discuss more about the Islamic economic system in the other session. Wassalam.